In the summer of 1942, while German panzers tore across the southern steppes of Russia and the city of Stalingrad braced for annihilation, Winston Churchill climbed aboard a converted Liberator bomber and flew east. His destination was Moscow. His mission was to look Joseph Stalin in the eye and tell him the one thing Stalin did not want to hear. There would be no second front in Europe that year, no Allied invasion of France, no rescue. The Red Army would have to hold the line alone for another 12 months, bleeding out against the full fury of the Wehrmacht, with nothing but promises and bombing raids from the West. Churchill later wrote that he felt as though he were carrying a large lump of ice to the North Pole. What happened over the next 4 days inside the Kremlin, behind closed doors and over bottles of vodka, would shape the fate of the entire Allied war effort. Two of the most powerful and dangerous men on Earth were about to meet for the very first time. One was fighting for the survival of his empire. The other was fighting for the survival of his nation. And before it was over, they would insult each other, drink together until 3 in the morning, and somehow walk away as allies. This is the story of that meeting. To understand why Churchill flew to Moscow, you have to understand what the world looked like in August 1942. It looked desperate. On the Eastern Front, Hitler had launched Operation Blue, a massive summer offensive aimed at 2 strategic targets: the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. The oil was essential. Germany's war machine was burning through fuel at a staggering rate, and the Caucasus fields at Maikop, Grozny, and Baku represented the richest petroleum reserves within reach. Stalingrad, meanwhile, bore Stalin's own name and sat at a vital crossroads of Soviet transport and industry. Losing it would be both a strategic disaster and a devastating symbolic blow. German Army Group South, numbering over 1.5 million men, supported by nearly 2,000 tanks and over 2,000 Luftwaffe aircraft, had smashed through Soviet lines in late June and advanced more than 300 miles in just 2 weeks. By early August, Hitler had split the force into 2 army groups. Army Group A was pushing deep into the Caucasus. Army Group B, spearheaded by General Friedrich von Paulus's 6th Army, was closing in on Stalingrad. The Red Army was reeling. Soviet losses in the first year of the war had already been beyond comprehension. Millions of soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Entire armies had been encircled and destroyed in the catastrophic opening months of Operation Barbarossa. And now, with the Germans driving south again in a massive new offensive, Stalin faced the very real possibility that the Soviet Union could lose access to its oil, its industrial heartland along the Volga, and perhaps the war itself. Stalin had one demand above all others, and he had been making it with increasing fury for over a year. He wanted the Western Allies to open a second front in France, a full-scale invasion across the English Channel that would force Hitler to pull dozens of divisions away from the east and relieve the unbearable pressure on the Red Army. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov had traveled to London and then Washington in May and June of 1942, and when he returned to Moscow, he told Stalin that President Roosevelt had essentially promised such an invasion before the end of the year. An Anglo-Soviet communique issued on June 12th had even stated that full understanding had been reached regarding the urgent tasks of creating a second front in Europe in 1942. But Roosevelt had been deliberately vague, making promises he knew the Allies could not keep, partly to maintain Soviet morale and partly to keep Stalin from making a separate peace with Hitler. The Americans were not ready. They had barely begun shipping troops across the Atlantic, and the British knew even more clearly that a premature cross-channel assault against Hitler's fortified Atlantic coastline would end in catastrophe. Churchill understood this in his bones. Britain had learned the hard way: the evacuation at Dunkirk, the debacle in Crete, the disastrous raid on Dieppe, which would come just days after Churchill left Moscow and prove exactly how dangerous an unprepared amphibious assault could be. Churchill carried the scars of the Dardanelles from the First World War, a failed amphibious campaign that had nearly destroyed his political career. He was not going to throw away another army on a doomed landing just to satisfy Stalin's timetable. But someone had to deliver the news, and Churchill decided that someone would be him. He did not have to go. A telegram could have carried the message. An ambassador could have relayed it. There was even an old dictum about not sending the messenger personally to deliver bad news. But Churchill believed something deeper was at stake. This was not just about one conversation or one military decision. It was about building a personal relationship with a man he had spent decades despising. Churchill had been one of the most vocal opponents of Bolshevism since the Russian Revolution of 1917. As Secretary of State for War, he had openly supported military intervention against the Soviets during the Russian Civil War. He had once declared his desire to strangle the Bolshevik state at its birth. And now, in the darkest stretch of the war, he was flying into that very state to beg its leader not to lose faith in an alliance that had barely begun. The British ambassador to Moscow, Sir Archibald Clark Kerr, a charming and eccentric diplomat who understood Soviet mentality better than most, had urged Churchill to come in person. Clark Kerr knew that Stalin was increasingly suspicious of the West, furious about the broken promise of a second front, and beginning to wonder openly whether Britain and America were content to let the Soviet Union do the dying while they waited safely on the other side of the English Channel. If Churchill did not come, the entire Grand Alliance could fracture. And if the alliance fractured, if Stalin negotiated a separate peace with Hitler, as he had done with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, the war might become unwinnable for the West. Churchill left London on August 1, 1942, heading first to Cairo to deal with a command crisis in the North African theater. The British Eighth Army had been battered by Rommel's Afrika Korps, losing Tobruk in a humiliating defeat in June and falling back to a defensive line at El Alamein, barely 60 miles from Alexandria. Churchill spent over a week in Cairo, shaking up the entire command structure. He replaced General Auchinleck with General Harold Alexander as Commander-in-Chief Middle East and installed the abrasive, meticulous Bernard Montgomery to lead the Eighth Army in the field. These were decisions that would prove pivotal in the months ahead. Then, shortly after midnight on August 10th, Churchill boarded the Liberator for the long flight east. The route took him through Tehran, then north across Soviet territory to Moscow. It was a grueling journey of more than 10 hours in an unpressurized aircraft, freezing at altitude. Churchill was 67 years old, overweight, and had already survived one heart episode during a visit to Washington the previous December. He arrived on the afternoon of August 12th, stepping onto Soviet soil for the first time in his life. Molotov met him at the airport, alongside a Red Army Guard of Honor. Churchill addressed the assembled press briefly, referring to the Anglo-Soviet alliance as one of comrades and brothers committed to destroying the Nazi regime until it was beaten into the ground. Comrades. The old anti-Bolshevik was speaking their language deliberately. But the real test was still hours away. That evening, Churchill was driven to the Kremlin for his first face-to-face meeting with Joseph Stalin. The British delegation was unusually small. The aircraft carrying most of Churchill's military advisors had suffered a mechanical fault and turned back to Tehran. So it was just Churchill, Ambassador Clark Kerr, an embassy interpreter named Major Charles Dunlop, and American envoy Averell Harriman, who had been sent by Roosevelt to demonstrate American solidarity with the British position. They were led through the Kremlin's corridors to Stalin's office, and there he was, Joseph Stalin. Short in stature, perhaps 5'4", deliberate in his movements, with his heavy mustache, his pockmarked face, and his calm, unblinking gaze. He wore a simple military tunic. He spoke softly and slowly. Churchill had spent years imagining this encounter. Now they were in the same room. Churchill later reported to London that the first 2 hours were bleak and somber. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He told Stalin directly that there would be no cross-channel invasion in 1942. The Anglo-American military staffs had examined the possibility exhaustively and concluded it could not succeed. The shipping was insufficient. The forces were not yet trained or assembled. A failed invasion would be worse than none at all, because it would hand Hitler a propaganda triumph and squander the resources needed for the real cross-channel operation planned for 1943, when over 1 million American troops would be in Britain and the assault could be launched with overwhelming force. Stalin's expression darkened immediately. The British minutes of the meeting record that he looked very glum. Then the questions came, sharp, blunt, and edged with contempt. Were the British afraid to fight the Germans? A man who was not prepared to take risks, Stalin said, could not win a war. The atmosphere in the room was turning hostile. But Churchill had anticipated this reaction, and he had come prepared with a secret that changed the entire shape of the conversation. He pivoted. A second front, he argued, did not have to mean the fortified coast of northern France. He reached for a pencil and drew a picture of a crocodile on a piece of paper. Here, he said, pointing to the snout, this is where the enemy is strongest. The teeth. Fortified France, lined with concrete bunkers and German divisions. You do not attack the teeth. But here, he said, running his pencil along the animal's underside, here is where the creature is soft, exposed, and vulnerable. North Africa, the Mediterranean, Southern Europe. Churchill then revealed Operation Torch, the highly secret Anglo-American plan to invade French North Africa that autumn. Massive American and British forces would land simultaneously in Morocco and Algeria, sweep east, trap Rommel's Africa Corps between the new invasion force and Montgomery's 8th Army advancing from Egypt, and smash the Axis presence in North Africa entirely. From there, the Allies could open the Mediterranean to shipping, threaten Italy, force Mussolini out of the war, and begin tearing apart Hitler's southern flank piece by piece. It was an audacious plan, and something remarkable happened in that room. Stalin grasped the strategic logic almost instantly. In a few moments, the Soviet leader rattled off 4 reasons why Torch made sense. It would strike the enemy in his undefended rear. It would set the Germans and the French fighting each other. It would put Italy in immediate jeopardy. And it would keep Franco's Spain neutral. Churchill was stunned by the speed of Stalin's strategic mind. He later wrote that this response demonstrated the dictator's swift and complete mastery of a military problem he had never studied before. And then Stalin said something that surprised every person in the room. May God help this enterprise to succeed. God. From the leader of the world's first officially atheist state. Nobody commented on it at the time, but the temperature in the room had shifted unmistakably. That first evening ended with cautious optimism. Churchill cabled his deputy in London, Clement Attlee, with the message, "He knows the worst, and we parted in an atmosphere of goodwill." But the goodwill did not last. The next day, August 13th, everything fell apart. Churchill met with Molotov alone in the morning and warned him that Stalin would make a great mistake to treat us roughly when we have come so far. Molotov listened and replied coolly that Stalin was a very wise man, and that however he argued, he understood all. That night, at 11 o'clock, Churchill returned to the Kremlin for a second formal meeting with Stalin. This time, the man across the table was completely different: cold, aggressive, relentless. Stalin handed Churchill a formal written aide memoir that systematically attacked the Western Allies for betraying their promise of a second front. The document argued that 1942 offered the most favorable conditions for an invasion, since Germany's best troops were committed in the East. It accused Britain of breaking its word. The tone was accusatory, almost prosecutorial. Stalin pressed the attack verbally. The British were afraid of fighting. They should not think the Germans were supermen. If you landed even 6 or 8 divisions near Cherbourg, you would relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. Churchill's anger built. He reminded Stalin that Britain had fought alone for an entire year, from the fall of France in June 1940 to the German invasion of Russia in June 1941, while the Soviet Union had been supplying Hitler with oil and grain under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. He said he pardoned the remark about British cowardice only on account of the bravery of the Russian troops. Harriman passed Churchill a note urging restraint, reminding him that Stalin always negotiated this way. But the meeting ended badly. Churchill returned to his dacha that night, seething. His personal physician, Lord Moran, recorded that Churchill fumed about Stalin's ingratitude. Did he not realize who he was speaking to? The representative of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen? Churchill was ready to pack his bags and fly home at dawn. The mission appeared to be in ruins. But the next morning, Clark Kerr came to see him. The ambassador spoke with the kind of blunt candor that Churchill respected. He must not leave Moscow in anger. He must not allow himself to be offended by a peasant who did not know any better. And if Churchill abandoned the Soviets now, Clark Kerr asked, how many young British and American lives would have to be sacrificed to make up for the loss? Churchill was persuaded. Reluctantly, angrily, he agreed to stay for one more round. On August 14th, the third day, Churchill attended a formal banquet at the Kremlin. Nearly 100 guests packed the Catherine Hall. 19 courses of food were served over several hours. Molotov presided as toastmaster, orchestrating an endless parade of toasts to Allied unity, to victory, to Roosevelt, to Churchill, to Stalin. General Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, described the evening as a complete orgy of food and drink. He noted among the dishes a small suckling pig whose black eye, he wrote, remained fixed on him all evening, developing what he could have sworn was a sardonic smile. It was a surreal spectacle. The leaders of a desperately embattled alliance exchanging elaborate courtesies, while German tanks advanced toward Stalingrad, while Soviet soldiers fought and died by the thousands each day. Stalin made it clear he wanted to repair the damage. He was warm and attentive, but Churchill remained cool. He had not forgiven the insults. After the banquet, with his departure scheduled for dawn, the visit appeared to be ending in polite failure. Then Stalin made his move. As Churchill rose to leave, Stalin asked casually when they would meet again. Churchill said he was leaving at dawn. Stalin paused, then asked, "Why do you not come over to my apartment in the Kremlin and have some drinks?" It was an extraordinary invitation. Stalin was offering Churchill something almost no foreign leader had ever received: access to his private world. No officials, no agendas, no protocol. Just two men and a bottle. Churchill hesitated for only a moment, then accepted. Stalin led the way through the corridors and passages of the Kremlin, through rooms and along hallways, until they reached his personal apartment. Churchill later described it as 4 rooms, simple, dignified, and of moderate size. The bookshelves were empty because Stalin's library had been evacuated east to Kuybyshev during the German advance on Moscow the previous winter. An elderly housekeeper began setting the table. And then Svetlana appeared. Stalin's daughter was just 16 years old, a redhead who came in to help lay out the dinner. Stalin introduced her to Churchill with unmistakable pride. The conversation turned briefly to their daughters. Churchill mentioned that his own daughter Sarah was also a redhead. It was a small, human moment between two men who had spent 3 days circling each other like rival predators. Svetlana later wrote that her father was in one of those amiable and hospitable moods when he could charm anyone. She stayed to help, but was gently dismissed when the talk inevitably returned to military matters. Stalin kissed her and told her to go about her business. What followed was one of the most remarkable evenings of the entire war. Stalin uncorked wine and suggested they call for Molotov, who was in another part of the Kremlin, worrying over the draft communique. "There is one thing about Molotov," Stalin said with a grin. "He can drink." Molotov arrived and the table filled with heavy Russian dishes, course after course, culminating in the inevitable suckling pig. The wine and spirits flowed without pause. Stalin teased Molotov relentlessly, and Churchill, his anger melting in the warmth of the evening, joined in. He asked Stalin whether he knew that Molotov, during his recent visit to Washington, had secretly sneaked off to see New York entirely by himself, and that the delay in his return had nothing to do with any problem with his aircraft. Molotov sat there with his famously blank expression, while Stalin and Churchill laughed. For hours, the 3 men talked about everything. The supply of trucks to the Red Army, which Stalin considered vital for moving infantry in support of his armored formations. The Napoleonic Wars, which fascinated both leaders as students of history. The Duke of Marlborough, Churchill's famous ancestor, whose military campaigns Churchill had written about extensively. And then the conversation turned to something unexpected: collective farms. Stalin became suddenly animated, admitting that the collectivization of Soviet agriculture had been a terrible struggle, a fearful process in which millions of kulak farmers had resisted and had been dealt with harshly. It was, he said, very bad and difficult. Churchill listened carefully. He was hearing something almost no Western leader had ever heard: Stalin speaking with a kind of rough candor about the human cost of his own policies. Around 1 in the morning, Sir Alexander Cadogan arrived, carrying the draft of the official communique. He walked into the apartment and was stunned by the scene. Churchill and Stalin and Molotov, sitting around a table groaning under the weight of food of all kinds, crowned by the suckling pig and surrounded by innumerable bottles. Stalin immediately offered Cadogan the pig. When the diplomat politely declined, Stalin attacked it himself, carving into it single-handedly while continuing the conversation. Cadogan later wrote that the drinks Stalin pressed on him seemed pretty savage, while Churchill, now complaining of a headache, had wisely switched to a comparatively innocuous, sparkling Caucasian red wine. Despite the state of the table, Cadogan noted that everyone seemed as merry as a marriage bell. The communiqué was reviewed, amended, and agreed upon around that table, between bites of pork and glasses of wine. The evening finally wound down sometime after 3 in the morning. Churchill had been in Stalin's company for nearly 7 unbroken hours. He stumbled back to his car, was driven to the dacha, and arrived past 3:15 with what he described as the worst headache he could remember. General Władysław Anders, the Polish commander whom Churchill had stood up earlier that evening to accept Stalin's invitation, was still faithfully waiting. Churchill apologized briefly and told Anders to follow him to Cairo, where they would talk properly. Then Churchill bathed and spent another hour relaying every detail of the evening to Clark Kerr and his military aides. By one account, Churchill afterward lay on his sofa, full length, chuckling, kicking his legs in the air, and repeating over and over, "Stalin was splendid. What a pleasure it was to work with that great man." 24 hours earlier, he had been ready to storm out of Moscow. Now he was giddy with triumph. The joint communiqué released that morning declared that the talks had been carried out in an atmosphere of cordiality and complete sincerity, and that both the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States would wage war against Nazi Germany with all their power and energy until complete victory was achieved. Churchill flew out of Moscow later that day, returning via Tehran and Cairo to England, where he arrived on August 24th, exhausted but satisfied. He believed he had accomplished something essential, not a treaty, not a detailed battle plan, something harder to define but equally vital to the war effort. He had looked Stalin in the eye, absorbed his insults, refused to be bullied, and then, in a private apartment over wine and roast pig, had found a frequency on which the two of them could communicate. Not as friends, not as ideological allies, but as two hard men who understood power, respected stubbornness, and needed each other to survive. The consequences of the Moscow meeting rippled outward through the rest of the war. Operation Torch, the North African invasion that Churchill had revealed to Stalin over a sketch of a crocodile, launched in November 1942 and succeeded. It drove the Axis out of Africa, cracked open the Mediterranean, led to the invasion of Sicily and the fall of Mussolini, and began the slow unraveling of Hitler's European fortress from the south. At Stalingrad, the very city whose impending siege had hung over every conversation in the Kremlin that August, the Red Army achieved one of the most decisive victories in military history. Soviet forces encircled and destroyed the entire German Sixth Army, over 250,000 men, in February 1943. It was the turning point from which the Wehrmacht never recovered. And the full cross-channel invasion that Stalin had demanded finally came on June 6, 1944, D-Day, launched with the overwhelming force that Churchill had always insisted was the only way to succeed. But none of it would have been possible without the alliance. And the alliance, in August 1942, was hanging by a thread. It survived because two proud, stubborn, deeply different leaders found a way to sit across a table, absorb each other's worst qualities, and decide that their shared enemy mattered more than their mutual suspicion. Churchill and Stalin would meet again, at Tehran in 1943, at Yalta in 1945, and once more in Moscow in 1944, when Churchill would scribble his famous percentages deal on a half sheet of paper, dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, while Stalin ticked it with a blue pencil. Their relationship was never easy and never warm. They argued fiercely over Poland, over the fate of the Balkans, over the shape of the post-war world. And in the end, the wartime alliance gave way to the Cold War, the Iron Curtain that Churchill himself would name in his 1946 speech at Fulton, Missouri, and 4 decades of nuclear standoff between the systems these two men represented. But in August 1942, none of that future was visible. What was visible was the present danger. German tanks rolling east, Soviet cities burning, an alliance fracturing under the weight of broken promises and mutual distrust. And one night in the Kremlin, over bottles of wine and a suckling pig, two of the most formidable leaders of the 20th century decided that the alliance would hold. Because it held, the war was won. And because the war was won, the world we live in today exists. If this story gripped you, hit subscribe so you never miss our deep dives into the untold stories of World War II. Drop a comment below and tell us, do you think Churchill was right to fly to Moscow himself, or should he have sent someone else?